Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf contains two Mishnayos, which divides the Daf into three sections. The two Mishnayos are both Mishnayos we've seen quoted earlier in the Masechta with Machloksim between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about things which may appear to be muktzah but are needed for tzarach Yom Tov. Now, the first part of the Daf, before the first Mishnah, the Gemara is commenting on the Mishnah which we have seen discussing what happens when somebody has set aside certain pigeons which he intends to shecht on Yom Tov, and then he comes back to take them and he doesn't quite find them the way he left them, and he's not sure if these are the same ones or not. In what situations can he assume these are the pigeons that he set aside and therefore they're not muktzah, he can take them? And what situations does he have to say, no, these are not those pigeons, or maybe they're not those pigeons, and therefore he can't use them because they're potentially muktzah? As we know, you cannot take a pigeon on Yom Tov to shecht unless you've said so, unless you've set it aside beforehand. The Machlok is Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. What you have to do, as we've seen earlier in the Masechta, but here you certainly have to set it aside and identify it, otherwise it's muktzah. So the Mishnah, previous Mishnah, on the last daf, had given us the halacha that if you have a nest, a pigeon coop with a nest of pigeons in it, and you identify several pigeons inside the coop, you say, this is the ones I want to take, or even all the pigeons inside the coop and say, this is the one I want to take. When you come back, you don't find them in the coop, you find them out of the coop. So the Mishnah says you cannot assume that these are the same ones and they came out of the coop. You have to assume that the ones that were in the coop flew away, and these might be other ones which arrived over here. So Gemara wants to say this is a proof to the halacha of Reb Chanina about a rov and karav. That's where you have something you're not sure where it came from. Do you say it came from the majority available, or do you say it came from the closest available? Here you have a similar situation. You have pigeons in front of a coop. The closest thing to be would be to say that it came from the coop, that they were in the coop, and these are the pigeons that came out of the coop to right outside the coop. That's called karav. That's the closest. However, the vast majority of pigeons available are not those. So the rov is pigeons that are far away. So here we see that Allah says you have to assume that it comes from the rov. So that would be a proof. Rabbi Chanina says you have to assume that it comes from the rov. So the Gemara says that's not necessarily the case. The case could be that the other pigeons that were available were just as close. How so? Two options. Rav Abaya first says that they could be that there was a ledge outside the pigeon coop, which you often find where other pigeons congregate. They're not allowed into the coop, but they congregate there, and therefore they're just as close. And therefore the original pigeons could have flown away, and these would still be around. Rava says the situation is that there were two nests within the coop. The coop is divided into many compartments, and there were two different nests, and he set aside the pigeons in one of the nests, and he found that that nest is empty. As a matter of fact, all the nests are empty, and there are pigeons outside his nest. The question is, can he assume that they are not? Now, Rava says the Mishnah has a specific chiddush, that if it would be the lower nest, let's say there's a lower nest and an upper nest. So if he set aside the pigeons in the lower nest, and he comes and he finds both the lower and the upper nests are empty, but there are pigeons outside on the porch outside the lower nest, there it is pasha that he can't assume that these are the ones that came out of the nest. Those might have flown away and these came down from upstairs, because pigeons often slip, they fall, they come down. The chiddush of this Mishnah is that even if he set aside the pigeons in the upper nest, and he comes back and he finds no pigeons, not in the lower nest, not in the upper nest, only outside the upper nest, he does have to assume that these pigeons did climb upwards, and now that they are above on the porch, above where they were before, and these are not the pigeons that he set aside earlier, and therefore it's asur. Okay, back to the Mishnah. The next halacha in the Mishnah had been that if he finds pigeons right outside his coop, that is, he set aside pigeons in a certain coop, he finds the coop's empty, but there are pigeons right outside. So if there are no other pigeons available that could have come, then he could assume that these are his, and then he's allowed to use them. So Gemara says, what's the case? What are we talking about over here? Option one, we're talking about pigeons that can fly. If they can fly, how in the world do you know that there's no other pigeons available? They could have flown from who knows where. And therefore, that can't make sense. So we must be talking about pigeons that are young. They haven't learned to fly yet. They're only pigeons that walk. Now, still, let's break it down. We have a rule that we've seen. Marokah Bachama says a pigeon that only walks up to 50 amas, doesn't walk further than 50 amas. So if we're outside 50 amas, so then it's pashut. Well, it's the Mishnah's chiddush. Obviously, you can't have come from somewhere else because there are no other nests within 50 amas of where you found them. Maybe you'll tell me that there are nests within 50 amas, so then how do you know that these pigeons came from your coop? Maybe they walked over from the neighboring coop, which is within 50 amas. So my answer is that the situation is that there is another nest within 50 amas. However, it is around the corner, and therefore you could assume that the pigeons didn't come from there. And this is the chiddush: pigeons don't walk. Pigeons which are on foot will not walk to a place where they cannot see their original nest. So always stay within eyesight. So if it's around the corner, says the Mishnah, chiddush, you could assume these are not the pigeons that came from a nest around the corner. If there's no pigeons within 50 amas within a line of sight, then you could assume that your pigeons are the ones that are found just outside the original coop. We now begin the next Mishnah, which introduces two more machloksim between Beitzah and Beis Shammai. Again, the issue here is the Gzeir D'Rabbanan, in this case Muktzah, versus the question of Simchas Yontif, where you require certain activities in order to be able to have meat or other things for Yontif. The two cases are using a large block of wood, which is a klisha melachte le'isr. It's generally used for grinding spices, which you can't do in Yontif. Using this large block of wood as a cutting board to chop up meat. That's an activity that's needed for Sudas and Simchas Yontif. And the other question is using the skin of an animal that you shachted, you let it spread it on the ground. So that can also help with people will walk on it. That'll start the tanning process, and also you're allowed to take it off the ground. Or is it muktzah if it doesn't have a concise of meat? If it has a concise of meat on it, it's not a muktzah. But the question is, what if it has no concise of meat? Can you pick it up from the ground? Now, in these two cases as well, if you do not have what to do with this skin of the animal in order to preserve it by spreading it at least on the ground and letting people walk on it, people will not want to shecht anything in Yontif because they'll lose the hide, they'll lose the skin, and therefore Beis Hillel says that you're allowed to. Now, in both of these cases, Beis Shammai says it's aser. Simchas Yontif doesn't help you. It's muktzah. Klisha melachte le'isr is muktzah, and spreading a hide on the ground for people to walk on is muktzah, and picking it up if it doesn't have meat on it, it's muktzah. And all of them, Beis Hillel says it's mutter. We see the Gemara earlier says Beis Hillel. The Gemara has the initial assumption that Beis Hillel's reasoning is because of Simchas Yontif. The Gemara says it's possible that Beis Hillel's reasoning is not because of Simchas Yontif. It could be that each Isser he disagrees with. Okay, now the Gemara begins here by quoting a Beitzah that says that everybody, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, both agree that after you've cut meat on a cutting board, you are now not allowed to move that cutting board anymore. This cutting board, of course, is not a real cutting board. It's a klisha melachte le'isr. And once you've used it, it's no longer needed. There's no tzarech yantif. It's not called tzarech gufa. You do not need it to cut anymore, and now it becomes muktzah, and you cannot do anything with it. Just have to leave it where it is. Now the Gemara limits both. Now the Gemara limits the machlokas in both cases of the Mishnah. The first one, which we said is the case of the big grinding wood you can use as cutting board, says Abaye that whole machlokas is only in the case of a klisha melachte le'isr, a big grinding wood. If you have an actual cutting board, there's no machlokas. Everybody agrees that you're allowed to use it. The Gemara says, of course. Why would I think there's a machlokas there? The Mishnah said that the whole machlokas is in the case where you're using a big grinding wood. It didn't say anything about a cutting board. So I gives two explanations. So this Gemara says first, the Gemara says it for Abaye, but Abaye didn't say himself. You may think that the machlokas also exists in the case of a cutting board, that you shouldn't be allowed to use it on Yontif because of tircha or because of muktzah. The only reason we discussed the case of the big block of wood was because we wanted to show you how far Beis Hillel's chiddush goes itself. That they are mater even in a case like that. The second, because it's melachte le'isr is the extra chiddush. In the case of the cutting board, which is melachte le'heter, that's also somewhat of a chiddush that melachte le'heter is not muktzah. Okay. The Gemara's other version of this is that Abaye answers for himself, and he says, no, my chiddush is that there's no machlokas in the case of a new cutting board which was never used before, because you may think that everybody will agree that it's aser, or that there will at least be a machlokas, and Beis Shammai will say that it's aser. Not that everybody will agree, but that Beis Shammai will say that it's aser because you might decide to change your mind. You might not want to use it at all. Since it was never used, it could be you'll want to care it and preserve it. So therefore you'll move it, you'll step it around, and then you'll end up not using it. It will not have been it will have been a tircha shalei l'tzarech, it will have been muktzah shalei l'tzarech, it won't be used l'tzarech gufa because you don't end up doing anything with it. So Gemara says, hold on a second. You mean to tell me that this is not correct, and that Beis Shammai agrees in the case of a new cutting board which you never use? That means that you're telling me that Beis Shammai is not concerned that you may change your mind and decide not to use something. But I'll show you two cases where Beis Shammai is concerned that you may change your mind and decide not to use something. Issue in both those cases is tircha. You're not allowed to do extra work on Yontif which is not needed for anything. In both these cases, Beis Shammai says something's usher because you may change your mind and decide not to use it. First case is where you want to slaughter an animal. So Beitzah Daf says you cannot move the animal to the slaughterer, the knife to the slaughterer, or the knife or the slaughterer to the animal. You can't move them around because you may decide to change your mind, and that would be extra tircha. Beitzah says it's mutter. The other case is spices, grinding spices in a type of grinder which is permitted to do on Yontif. You can't bring the grinder to the spices or the spices to the grinder, or any of these things. Also, tircha, you may decide not to grind at all. So here, you see, again, the Gemara's question is that Beitzah Shammai is concerned and will ask things because of tircha, because you may change your mind. So then how come you're telling me about it? Then in the case of the new cutting board, they hold that you will not change your mind. You don't have to be concerned of changing minds, and therefore you're allowed to move even the new cutting board in order to use it. So the Gemara answers very simple. The case of the cutting board, there's no reason why they would change their mind. In the other two cases, there is a very good reason they would change their mind. What's that? So in the case of the shechita, you may change your mind and decide you don't want to shech this animal. Maybe you find a different animal that is fatter or more juicy, and you want to shech that one instead of this one, and therefore you'll end up not shechting any tircha shel tzarich. In the case of the spices, you may decide not to grind the spices at all. You may say, I'll make a different dish for supper that doesn't require spices. It's something that's non-spiceable. Rashi gives examples of which cooked dishes require spices and which do not. So therefore there's a possibility you'll change your mind. Here though, you already have meat. You already shechted, you have meat. You need to cut it on a cutting board. You're not going to change your mind and say, oh no, I'm not going to cut it on a cutting board. The meat's going to spoil otherwise. You have to do something with it, and therefore Beitzah Shammai are not concerned for changing your mind. Okay, now the Gemara goes very similar back and forth in the case of spreading the hide on the ground for people to walk on. Our first quotes a Beitzah and says that Beitzah and Beitzah Shammai both agree that you are allowed to salt meat over the skin, even though salt will fall on the skin and begin the tanning process, which includes salting. So that's what the Beitzah begins with. And Abaye says that that's only true if you're salting the meat lightly. You're salting it to be used for roast meat. Before we roast meat, we have to get the blood out, but we only have to get out a little bit of the blood, so we salt it. However, before you cook it, you have to get all the blood out, and then you have to salt it heavily. So Abaye says this is the type of salting where it's light salting, heavy salting that you would use before you cook the meat, that you can't do over the skin because that'll put too much salt onto the skin and begin the tanning process. And where again says pshita, of course, the Beitzah said you're allowed to salt it for tzli, for roasting. It did not say anything about for a pot. So the Gemara answers for Abaye, the chiddush is for something called tzli ke'ein kedera, where it's being roasted, but it's a type of roasting where it requires a lot of salt, so it's almost as much salt as cooking itself. And Abaye is saying that you are allowed to do. Now the Gemara brings another Beitzah on a related subject. The Gemara will analyze the Beitzah. The Beitzah says you're not allowed to salt fats. That is, you shach an animal on Yontif, and now you have the fats, and the fats are going to spoil and they're going to go off. So what can you do to preserve them? So the Beitzah says you're not allowed to salt these fats. You're not allowed to turn them over, which kind of hardens them to preserve them. Rav Yishuv says you are allowed to hang it up on sticks so that it blows in the wind, and the wind will keep it cool and prevent spoilage. Now the Gemara quotes Rav Masa says that the halacha is like Rav Yeshua, and a different version, it can mean that Rav Masa said that the halacha is against Rav Yeshua. So the Gemara says if he's telling me that the halacha is like Rav Yeshua, you understand that I need him to tell me that, because Rav Yeshua is an individual against the group. Usually the halacha, when it's the many against the one, is the halacha is like the rabbim, the halacha is like the many. I would need Rav Masa to tell me that's not the case here. If, however, this is a standard case and the halacha is not like Rav Yeshua, so why would I need Rav Masa to tell me that? The answer is because there is a very strong logic to Rav Yeshua's position, and that's that if you do not allow them to find some way to preserve it, people may not shecht because they're afraid that they will lose the value of the fats, it will spoil. So Gemara says, well, that's a good argument. How come we say that the halacha is not like him? don't we say that in the case of spreading the skin on the ground, you are allowed to do that according to Beis Hillel, which is the halacha, because if we don't let you, then you won't shech, then you will not have simchas yantif, so you should be allowed to spread the fats for the same reason. So Gemara says, no, the spreading of the skin on the ground is not such a problem halachically, because it's useful, and people will kneel on it and use it as a rug, and people will understand that that's what it's for. They won't think that you're just allowed to preserve things on yantif. However, spreading the fats on the sticks to blow in the wind, people will say, oh, I'm allowed to preserve fats, that's good to know, and then they'll end up salting the fats. Salting the fats is definitely forbidden. There was no heter for that. Now the Gemara discusses, you're allowed to salt multiple pieces of meat on yantif if you only need one of them. The issue is extra tircha. So Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, you're allowed to do them if you do them all at once. Now do more than you need, because that's again extra tircha. But if you have a bunch of pieces of meat together and you don't need them all, you can salt them all in one shot. That's not much of a tircha. Rav Bar Abba used a technique called Marim. In certain circumstances where you only have an Isser D'Rabbanan that's created as a safeguard, you're allowed to do what's called Marim, to play a trick. And that's it. He would salt all the pieces of meat by changing his mind which one he wanted. He would say, oh, I want this one, salt it. Then he would say, I want the next one, and he would salt it. And he'd say, hey, no, that one looks more delicious, and salt that one. And this way he salted all the pieces of meat. Again, it's not fooling anyone, but sometimes you need this halachic device of finding a technically permitted way of doing things in order to allow escape from a Gzeira D'Rabbanan that the Rabbanan wanted to limit anyway in such circumstances. We now begin the next Mishnah, which introduces another Machlokes Beis Hillel by Shammai. This is about taking the shutter off a storefront and using it as a table. Beis Hillel say that is permitted. You're allowed to take it off, and you're even allowed to put it back when you finish. And Beis Shammai say that is usher. The Gemara first brings Ula, who defines what these shutters are. He says that they are shutters of stores. The Mishnah didn't say stores. And then Ula lists three things. The Gemara adds a fourth, that are only permitted because if we didn't allow you to do them, you would not do something else that we wanted you to do. And the Gemara will question why we need Ula to say that and explain them all. So, Ula says there are three things which are what's called Hitiru Seifim Misham Tchilasan. We wanted you to do what you want to do, and we were afraid if we didn't let you put it back or do something afterwards, you would stop doing something which we want you to do. And they are these two things which we just discussed, and two Mishnayos plus one more. Ula lists the first one is laying the skin of the animal on the ground after you've shechted it on Yantif. We allow you to do that, even though ordinarily it would be muktzah, or it would be the beginning of the tanning process, because otherwise you wouldn't shecht on Yantif and then you wouldn't do simchas Yantif. The second thing Ula says is taking the shutters off the stores and setting them up as tables to allow people to shop. That's also simchas yantif. We want people to be able to go shopping on yantif, of course, without exchanging money, without fixing a price. But we want people to be able to shop on yantif so that they have supplies and equipment for yantif that they need. If we didn't let you put them back, or if we didn't let you spread them out, people wouldn't open their stores at all. And the third thing is putting a bandage on a wound in the Beis HaMikdash. That halacha is as follows. Generally, you're not allowed to bandage a wound on Shabbos or on Yantif because of a Isser D'Rabbanan. Rashi first says because of Mamachek, which is a potential Isser D'Oraisa. Later he says it's an Isser D'Rabbanan. But you're not allowed to do that. But we allowed you to do that if you are Kohen, and you have a bandage on already, and you need to take the bandage off in order to be able to do the avoda, because when doing the avoda, one is not allowed to have anything intervening between his hand, his skin, and the klishares that he's using in the big dekuna that he's wearing. So he has to take the bandage off. Now, if we didn't let them put the bandage back on afterwards, people wouldn't take it off to do the avoda in the first place, therefore we allow it. Now, Rechava adds a fourth thing. Rechava says that the same applies in a machlokes between Rav Yehuda and the Chachamim as to whether or not, as to what the halacha is about a person opening a new barrel of wine or making a new batch of bread to sell on the regel. Now, we want people to sell wine on the regel. We want the Olei regel to be able to buy wine. For some Chosyantif, we want them to be able to have bread. Problem is like this. The Amaratzim are all over the place in Yerushalayim, and they are all Tameh. And if we allow them to buy, they're going to be Matame everything. Now, generally, on Yantif itself, that's not an issue, because on Yantif itself, we say that the Tumah of Amaratzim, people are unlearned, even though they're a Tameh, we say that that's permitted. it's only Asr Midrabanan. We don't know for sure that they're Tameh, and we take that Gzeir Darbanan off in order to not embarrass those Amaratzim. That's during Yantif itself. What's going to happen afterwards? What's going to be with all the wine that's left in the barrel and all the bread that's left in the batch that you made in order to sell on Yantif? Now Yantif is over. Everybody went home. You no longer have the rule that on Yantif, Amaratzim and what they touch are not Tameh. Is this bread Tameh now because of all the Amaratzim who touched it on Yantif? Or do you say, no, it wasn't Tameh then, it's not Tameh now? So that's the Machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chacham. The Chacham say it becomes Tameh as soon as Yantif is over. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not Tameh. It's fine. You can continue to sell it to Talmidei Chachamim who watch Hilchos Tahara. So again, the reason for that is that if we wouldn't allow you to do that, says Rechava, then people would never make a new batch of bread, and they would never open a barrel to sell because they don't want to ruin the barrel, and then after Yantif they won't be able to sell it because we'll consider it to be Tameh. So now the Gemara asks that all these four things are mentioned in the Mishnah. Why do I need Ula to tell me each of them? And the Gemara says each of them, the Chiddush is that the reason that they are permitted is because we don't want you to hold back from doing something else. And that changes the halacha. In the first case that Ula said, which is the case of spreading the hides on the ground, we want to make sure that you understand that the reason that's permitted is because we don't want people to not shecht, and therefore if you've shechted an animal before Yantif, you don't have this heter. You may have thought that the heter is because it's not muktzah, because it is usable as a rug. That's why Beitzah holds that it's permitted. Not because we want to give you a special heter in order that you should be encouraged to shecht on Yantif. And therefore, if you shechted before Yantif and you never spread it out, if the reason it would be mutter was because it's not muktzah, so you'd be allowed to spread it out even now. It's not muktzah, what's the problem? But that's not the reason. The reason is because we wanted to encourage you to shecht. If you didn't shecht on Yantif, you shechted before Yantif and you didn't get around to spreading it out, that's also you can't spread it out now because that reason doesn't apply. The second thing was the storefronts. And again, we want you to understand that the reason that it is permitted is because we want people to be encouraged to have their stores open, and not for a different reason, and that is that ein binyan bekalim, that there's no isser of putting shutters in and out of a large movable object. Now, the storefronts were movable objects. Now, you may have thought that that's the reason that is permitted, because to place the shutter in the window, which is, of course, a problem of binyan, it looks like you're fixing or attaching one piece to another piece, or taking it off, which is a stira, the opposite, all these things. You may think that's permitted because it's kalim. The isser of binyan is only in something that's attached to the ground, fixed to the ground, or to a house or something like that. But if it's just a big kli, that's permitted. If that would be the case, then you would be allowed to keep the stores open them or closed, or open and close large objects, or fronts or windows or shutters and things like that, even if it's not stores. You're not helping anybody by keeping them open. But that's not the reason, says Ula. The reason is because we want people to keep their stores open, and therefore it's only permitted if it's helping people as far as having their stores. Now, Ula's third thing was the bandages in the Beitzah Mikdash. The Gemara says, again, you may have thought the reason is because of Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. You may have thought there is no Gzeira D'Rabbanan of putting a bandage on in the Beitzah Mikdash, as we often have a rule, there's no Gezeiras in the Beitzah Mikdash. And therefore, this could apply even if it has nothing to do with the avoda, even if it's not in order to keep the avoda going. You're allowed to put the bandage on. Has nothing to do. It's a basic bandage. You're allowed to put a bandage on. Therefore, who has to say no? The only reason is because otherwise you won't do avoda, because you won't want to take the bandage off. And if it's nothing to do with doing avoda, then you're not allowed to do it. Now, the Gemara discusses Rechava's case. Why over there does he have to tell me that you're going to not make the doughs and open the barrel of wine if we did not allow it? So Mar says, again, you may have thought there's a different reason there. You may have thought that Rav Yehuda, the reason that Rav Yehuda holds that the dough and the wine does not become tamei after Yantif is because he understands when Chazal set up that on Yantif we're not going to embarrass Amaratzim by making things they touch tamei, that they set that up, that there is no tumah. The tumah is gone. It doesn't apply. And it doesn't come back after Yantif is over. And therefore, if that would be the halacha, that would apply even to a barrel or a bread that was made before Yantif, and it was open for sale before Yantif, and then it was touched by Amratzim on Yantif. That is not metameh. But that's not the reason. The reason is because we want you to open a new batch in Yantif, and therefore it only applies if the batch was opened on Yantif. If it wasn't opened on Yantif, then it does have the halacha of tumah, because we didn't need to allow it in order to encourage you to keep it open on Yantif. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know why doesn't the Ula mention Rechava's case? The Gemara says the Ula did not want to get into a machlokes. Ula only listed things that are not a machlokes. The Gemara says, is that so? Ula's things are only true according to Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai argues. The Gemara says Beis Shammai is not considered a machlokes. Beis Hillel is so clearly the halacha is so clearly like Beis Hillel. We even have a Baskal that said so. It's not considered to be discussing a machlokes. It's not something that's up for discussion. The Gemara now notes that our version of this Mishnah does not fit with a different version. Our version said that the machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is both by taking the shutter off the store and putting it back on. According to a different version, the machlokes is only about putting it back on, but taking it off, there is no machlokes. Everyone agrees that you are allowed to. Now we have two conflicting brises which limit what case the machlokes is, and the question is there a tzir? Now a tzir is a peg of some sorts. It could either be a hinge or a handle or a latch or something that fixes the shutter to the window or to the space that it goes into. Now there are three potential ways that this could be set up. There could be two tiers on the sides of the shutter, there could be one tier in the middle, or there could be zero tiers. So the Gemara leaves the possibility of the one in the middle out for now. The Gemara has one of Brises that says the assumption is that if there's a tier, it's more likely to be usher because it looks more like it's being built on. So the Gemara brings one Brisa that says that the whole machlokes is where there is a tier, but if there's no tier, then everybody agrees it's mutter, and the other Brisa says the other way, it's only machlokes if there's no tier, but if there is a tier, everybody says it's usher. So the Gemara says contradiction, and the Gemara says no contradiction. They're both saying about the case where there are two tiers on the sides, and the case where there is no tier at all. If there's no tier, everybody agrees it's mutter. If there's two tiers, everybody agrees it's usher. That's what both Brises are saying. What is the machlokes? Machlokes is where there's one tier in the middle. There it's kind of halfway. It appears to be like building, but not so much. And the question is, do we make a gzeira? If you have that one tier in the middle, if you're allowed to do that, you may end up using where there's two tiers on the sides. Do we have such a gzeira or not? And that's the machlokes according to these two brises as to what Beitzah and Shammai are arguing about.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.